Hello and welcome to the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. We're delighted to have Lasse Rørbæk's paper today, Ethnic Conflict Escalation or Ethnicized Conflicts, Assessing the Political Exclusion Civil War Relationship. And Sydney Gann is going to get us started. She's having some issues with her camera, so it will be a funky picture with a sound bubble around it. Turn it over to Sid.
All right, well, hello. I'm Cindy, the mysterious picture. I'm a PhD candidate at FSU. And I just like to start off with 3 discussion points before turning it over. So 2 will be in regards to the case selection, and 1 will be a request for clarification. And I'm just going to start with the latter. So at the very bottom of page 9, you write, in regards to indiscriminate violence, importantly, these violations cannot be everyday violations by an undisciplined security apparatus. It needs to be deliberate attempts to damage or destroy the mobilized ethnic group. So I have 2 questions regarding the concepts here. First, what do you mean by undisciplined security apparatus? And second, how do you distinguish between everyday violations and deliberate attempts to damage or destroy? Because when I think of undisciplined security apparatus, I think of like a community defense group or a militia, right? And these may or may not act in the absence of a weak state, in the absence of a strong state, or in lieu of a state that's attempting to obfuscate. So just more clarification on that. My second point in regards to case selection, on page 12, you note that you only consider a rebel organization if it enjoys large support among the ethnic group's members. So the way this is presented to us, I'm uncertain if that support is a requirement at the mobilization stage or at the conflict onset stage. So I know in the footnote 5, you say that this criterion only results in the loss of 2 cases, but some further discussion or justification may assuage concerns that you've limited variation on something important for your second causal mechanism, right? The growth in group support in response to indiscriminate violence. And then my final point, while reading your section about the contradictory cases, I was struck that they seem to be cases of conflict continuation and not onset. So I just want to ask, do all of these cases have conflict initiated by the state in response to a recent conflict event or one in the past? Are these different from the other cases in the supporting section and the alternative mechanism section? And I ask because it seems to me that these don't necessarily contradict the theory, right? At some point, an excluded ethnic minority rebelled, and the conflict may have or may not have been adequately settled. So this resulted in decision calculus by the states on the state's part, which makes the state the prominent actor, right, in the continuation of conflict, but not necessarily in its onset. And with that, because you guys can't see me, I was gesturing for you guys to turn it over. Go ahead and do that.
Okay, thank you, Sid. So let's turn it to Lasse, give him a chance to respond, and the floor is open. So bring your 1 fingers, or and nobody had a 2 finger that I missed, did they? No. Okay, great. Lasse.
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. These are great comments. First of all, just to introduce myself, my name is Lasse. I'm an assistant professor at Aarhus University in Denmark, so it's dark and cold outside here. I handled in my dissertation this spring and defended it in June on ethnic conflicts more generally, and this paper is the last paper of this dissertation. Yeah, so I'm very happy to get all your comments on that. So about your comments, Sydney, I think you're right about these conceptualization issues needing more justification. So my idea about violent repression needed to be targeted at ethnic groups was, of course, that I have to differ between these low capacity countries where security forces use kind of thug violence or whatever to get gains for themselves, and then violent repression targeted at these ethnic groups in order to hinder them for mobilizing and challenging the regime. But I get your point, and I will try to be more more clear about that. And I think about the justification for the group support for rebel organizations. I think actually this is a way to accommodate the theory, and not to make it too easy for me to show that the theory is not exactly on the spot here. But I'll try to make that more clear as well. Concerning the contradictory cases, so you're right that one part of these cases are conflict continuation, or at least conflict that used to be and then stopped and then reignite, so to speak. But the other group of these contradictory cases are, as I argue, cases where excluded groups only become excluded after the civil war had begun. So of course I see that as a problem for the theory. But yeah, I much appreciate your comments.
Okay, great. And Sid, you'll have to actually, if you want to do a 1 or a 2 finger, you'll actually have to type it in. I just realized. But I've got Christian on 1 finger and the queue is open.
Lasse, good piece. Very thoughtful. I have many comments. I'll send you the written comments that I have in detail through the piece. Just some things to get started, though. I take Sydney's kind of like prompting to be very legitimate in the sense that I was unclear of some things and some clarification points. So if we could start with some kind of clarification stuff. So I'm wondering if, because you have people that are getting kind of like mobilized after a certain conflict gets started, right? And so a large part of this is a function of how things are being operationalized, or maybe how they're being defined. Because I'm kind of like, how best to put it? So like, what is the Civil War designation capturing? What is the ethnic mobilization capturing? Because the Civil War that's being designated by the number of deaths that you get during the conflict, right? But the ethnic mobilization, that's got nothing to do with your ability to kill people. It's got something to do with the articulation of a claims-making effort, and that basically being somewhat organized, not militarized per se, but organized. And so I'm wondering, does a distinct conceptualization of the ethnic grievance or that organization, does that potentially lead to something different? Like if you had a collectively mobilized armed kind of categorization, would that lead to more of a connection with the Civil War? So I like the fact that you're bringing together distinct literatures. We talked about this before. This is one of the things I like about your work in general, and I like about kind of where we are right now in the field. But I was getting a little bit lost in the sense that you have people being mobilized by some conflict, but it's not that they necessarily weren't mobilized before. It's about how it's being defined and detected. And related to that is kind of like, for those that aren't familiar with EPR, I'm like, how is EPR not MAR back in 1980? I'm just like, how is this different? Where are they getting information from? So you say it's politicized ethnic groups. I'm just like, isn't that MAR? And so give me that distinction, right? Because MAR went through all these issues, and then you had the AMAR, and then you have selection questions. And I was just trying to figure that out. So on those basic points, I was kind of struggling a little bit. So some clarification on that would be useful.
Julian, is that a 2 finger? Or well, Lasse, do you want to respond? Because Julian, you can obviously shed some light on EPR. I don't know if that's where you were thinking about going. Let me ask Lasse if you'd like to respond first, or maybe it would be useful to. Okay, let's go with Lasse.
So the clarification between EPR and MAR, I think that's that would be easy for me, but I'm not quite sure, Christian, about the definitional matter you stressed with regards to civil war on the one hand, and the ethnic mobilization on the other hand. So maybe at a later point you could expand a bit on that.
Okay, let's turn it to Julian on either the two or the one, whichever is your next either way.
Yeah, hi, I'm Julian. I'm at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, which I recently joined as an assistant professor. I have a ton of comments about this paper, which I really like in general. But I think I'll start at the very end, which sort of mirrors the two previous comments. So let's talk a little bit about the contradictory cases, and in particular, what you denounce as reverse causation in that sense. So I think one thing that should not be forgotten conceptually is that exclusion is inherently a dyadic phenomenon. So there's one party that excludes, and there's another party that is excluded. Okay, and conflict occurs between the two of them potentially. That's the theory, right? So some of these, I was particularly struck by your interpretation of the Iraqi invasion, where you argue that exclusion is the result of an ongoing conflict. Yes and no. I'm a little bit troubled by this because clearly the stakes were on the table, right? So with the prospects of this invasion, it was very clear what would happen to the incumbent regime and the associated ethnic groups, the Sunnis, right? So the Sunnis in Iraq make up, what is it, something like 15 to 20% of the population. And if an invasion occurs, it's quite clear that under a democracy, which at the time was presumably the goal of the invasion, the Sunnis would be left out from government, right? The Shias have an overwhelming majority. And so in anticipation of this, I think it's fairly obvious that this was actually driving the conflict. That the very anticipation of this turning the tables and prospects and under ethnic voting in elections were quite causal here. Should also not forget that the theory which you are presumably trying to test is somewhat memory-free when it comes to the origins of exclusion, right? So what the specific reasons for why a group is excluded or included is relatively irrelevant. It might boost things, but in principle, that's the theory is static in time, right? It's focusing on snapshots, which also plays into this reverse causation issue. In general, I think reverse causation in this context is more about expectations or anticipations, which again has a lot to do with the fact that exclusion is dyadic, as I said. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, great. Lasse, I actually have a two-finger on that. Should I go with it? Okay. It was actually also my one finger, and the queue is open. And I liked the way Julian characterized that because it helped me. I was not persuaded by the reverse causation arguments. So just be flat out about that. And it's I'm not entirely sure if that's because I don't think I'm persuadable, or it's that I didn't find the information you provided persuasive. I think it might be the first. And Julian's comment helped me think about that a little better than I had been. And so what's very unclear to me is what you believe the theory is saying with respect to what it means to identify a conflict's origins. Whatever your answer is to that question, I don't think it matches my own, I don't want to sit here and try to define that on my side, because that's not what's important here. It's what do you, so at a minimum, some clarification about unpacking why you think that's reverse causation, not in terms of providing us with cases, but in terms of laying out what the theory expects. Because the issue over which mobilization occurs is there prior to mobilization. It's just that mobilization didn't happen. So I'm not sure if you're thinking that some new grievance has to come along and then it gets acted on. But in any case, some more unpacking, and I wonder if you could try to address that from the context of, that Julian's talking about it and being static snapshots, as well as from this idea of does it have to be new?
Yeah, so I haven't really thought about this anticipation thought that it might be enough to anticipate exclusion, but I think it's rather clear that if these groups, for instance, the Sunnis in Iraq, if they are already fighting before they get excluded, then of course we cannot postulate that there is a causal effect of exclusion on civil war onset. Then it's simply something else going on. But this anticipation thought that might be a part of the solution to figuring that out.
Okay, Julian has it too, and Christian has it too. Julian, yours was on specifically that. Can I come to you next, Chris?
Yeah, very briefly. I would just say that some of the evidence that you present as contradictory is at best inconclusive. Right? I think that's a better way to, or a more adequate, at least in my understanding, a better representation.
Okay, Christian.
Yeah. So my part of my issue is kind of like where you think this piece fits in the following scenario, right? So first we start with all groups, then we have excluded and non-excluded groups, then we have those that mobilize regarding that exclusion and those that don't mobilize, then we have those that choose insurgency in particular as a mobilization strategy and those that don't. And then you have those that are countered repressively by those that are countered by the government and those that aren't countered. And then you have subsequently those that are repressed versus those that are non-repressed, accommodated in some way, shape, or form, ignored or whatever. And then you have your escalating groups in response to that repression and not. And so I'm more systems oriented and old school systems dynamics and cybernetic in orientation than formal. So I think in terms of these feedback loops and sorting mechanisms at all, but you can work out that tree, right? And so I was trying to figure out kind of like where your stuff is fitting, right? Because in a sense you have where is exclusion coming from, and then you also have this escalatory dynamic. but you're not trying to explain the initial exclusion. You're kind of like assuming that, then kind of go from there. But what kind of bothered me was kind of like, well, where the exclusion came from is in part connected to Julian's conception of the dyadic interaction and the dynamics and why things might roll out the way that they do. So if the exclusion is based upon how the state was created in a non-ethnic way, that's one thing. If it's how the state was created based upon historical ethnic problems, then that's something different. Remember, like, I mean, the reason I mentioned Marr was because they code slightly different things, but EPR might have this, right? So Marr used to pay attention to, and Gur paid attention to his work, kind of like, how was the state created? What was the pre-state condition, basically? And how did you get to the state? And that kind of like sets you on a particular pathway. So sorry, that's more one-ish than two-ish, but yeah, that was my initial inclination. You'll see a bunch of my comments, however, keep coming back to this issue in different ways.
Lasse?
Yes, so just to clarify, would you suggest, Christian, that I look at why these groups actually got excluded in the first place, even though that were excluded prior to the mobilization?
Yeah, why and how?
Yeah.
Right, that strikes me as the way I think about this argument is there, why the exclusion occurred or why there are grievances doesn't strike me as important. It's just, are there grievances? That seems to me to be stage one, and they don't have to have been proximate. And it seems to me I'm not positive that you want them to be proximate. And if that's the case, then I think you need to make that argument, and you really need to argue that that's what the authors you're testing were saying. And I haven't read it that way, but so I would agree. I would agree with that characterization by Chris. I have another theoretical point that a one finger. And does anybody have a one or a two they want to put on the queue? Because okay, Chris does. And Julian, great. So I want to see you talk a little bit about how you think, what your notion of the causal mechanism is. Sorry, not what it is, but your notion of causation. And it turns out I'm teaching a course, then that is literally what we're reading this week. So, my apologies that you haven't, but hopefully I would have brought it up anyway. Because I think I know what the notion of causation is in the work that you're building off of or speaking to. And I think that's, one of the versions of probabilistic causation, right? It's definitely not necessarily sufficient conditions, et cetera. And so, so you've selected, the logic of your approach makes tons of sense if you're, and your approach, and I mean the Gertz and Mahoney and the other authors there, makes tons of sense if you're dealing with necessary and sufficient, or if you're trying to do some kind of a time, like this has to happen, that has to happen, this has to happen, or some concatenation of combinations has to happen, or the event doesn't occur. But that's not, in my thinking at all, what any of the people who, whether we go back to Gur or whatnot, expect to happen. And so I don't know why you would want to take I don't know what the threshold is once you shift into the design that you've got for finding contrary or not evidence. I certainly wouldn't expect all of the cases to fall out in the path direction that you're talking about. It's probabilistic after all, right? So, so I guess I would like to see a little bit more attention to that. I think you want to head off readers like me who are going to start thinking, wait a second, the causal argument that you're actually testing isn't what they're arguing. And because I don't expect you to agree with this. So I encourage you to, as you lay out the logic of the design, to address that a little bit more clearly. I think you take it as given that the patterns that you find are very much at odds with their statistical findings in large N work, and I'm not actually so sure that's the case. So I guess I'd like to see you strengthen that.
Yeah, so that comment made a lot of sense to me. Well, thanks. But I still think that if more than half of these cases, the ethnic groups actually don't support the rebel organization because of grievances, then I think there is a basic problem with the theory, or at least the theory is only able to explain a part of the variation that it actually claims to be explaining. But I get your point about it being at least a challenge to test a probabilistic theory with these deterministic causal designs. I get that.
Okay. I've got Christian and then Julian on a one finger.
Oh, I had a 2 actually.
Okay, Christian on the 2.
So my 2 was it's like I mean, Lasse, you just kind of slid this in. It was like the ethnic group has an opinion regarding what's going on. I'm just like, much of this literature doesn't say who rebels. All it says is n number of deaths are generated. You just added a nuance that is not clearly at all articulated by I'd say maybe the bulk of the individuals that you're citing, because their conceptual idea of what civil war is has nothing to do with who those people are. You're kind of bringing together literatures, right? So there's some people that talk about the after effect of kind of moral outrage and how that leads to wider participation, or some of Erica and Maria's work, which kind of talks about like the diffusion of these kind of tactics. You're kind of wetting that literature with this kind of more structuralist and behavioralist thing on the side, where the circumstances under which you're likely to see some civil war onset. And then you're linking the onset and the escalation literatures. And it's just like a lot of the onset literature, you know, from the unpublished piece I had with Dave and Lischbach back when we tried to talk about escalation, they were all about, you know, it's all about structural characteristics and grievances and so forth. But the grievances I saw as being related to repressive behavior, which wasn't a structure, it was a behavior. So, I mean, there's a bunch of things that you were pulling together. But the thing you just said made me think that who rebels is kind of rarely discussed, but you're explicitly trying to get at that. And so I think that distinction would be useful to highlight.
I think that's the way you ended. I totally agree with it. But I think you're actually mistaken about the Cederman, et cetera, crowd, and Julian can correct us on this and figure out which one of us is right pretty quickly, as well as Lasse. But I think that's Julian's dyadic point, right? Is that unlike much of the work that had gone on before, they actually are looking at dyads, right? So that the critique that you laid out is absolutely correct for, you know, literature up until that point, where they started then trying to look at dyadic outbreak across ethnic groups, which is what EPR's whole approach is trying to do. Julian, am I on point or off point here?
You're on point.
Okay.
You're on point.
Okay.
So
muted myself.
So my clarification on that, as we're getting to some kind of understanding, was, okay, I understand the dyad part, but do we know about the mass population? So first off, that's triadic, and second, or is that somehow lumped into one of the sides, right? You're just like, you get to who's shooting who, and that's the dyad. Lasse is bringing up this issue of how the population that may potentially not be armed already is responding to this dyadic interaction. Now, I didn't think it was including that.
Lasse, and then we've got a two from Julian.
Yeah, maybe we should just go to Julian.
Okay, so as a clarification for Christian, so in principle, this is triadic data, or at least the underlying data is triadic, in the sense that the conflict coding that EPR has been using for the last couple of years is based on a mapping between the rebel organizations or the non-state armed non-state actors that the Uppsala pre-conflict data list collects, and ethnic groups. And what we have tried to map is or two criterion that Lasse mentions in the paper. First, what we want to see is that the rebel organization, the non-state actor, actively recruits from the specific group. That's the one direction, but we also want to see the opposite direction, namely that the rebel organization claims explicitly or at least implicitly to operate on behalf of the group, in the interest of the group. And then if these two criterions are jointly given, we would code the group being in conflict, with the implicit understanding that there is an agent that does it for the group.
Okay, and Chris, I think, wants to come back, but let me just say to Lasse before he does, I think a takeaway for you here is, this ties back to Chris's first point, which is for the people who aren't as familiar with the EPR data. I mean, you know, and this is just to generalize the point for all of us as we write it, this is the audience point, right? If you are willing to assume that everybody who is reading your paper has read these works and is on top of the data, you don't really need to go into it so much. But, you know, so people think about, well, I want to publish in AJPS or JOP or APSR. Well, those presumably get broader audiences, right? Where you can't assume as much, right? So it's the difference between giving a, you know, a job talk in an entire department versus giving a talk at Peace Science. At Peace Science, you're going to have a different talk because you can leverage so much jargon and don't need to do as much backstory, et cetera. So as you do revisions and think about where you're going to send this, I encourage you to give some real thought to that, because obviously it eats space to talk about it, and journal editors have space limitations for some reason that makes no sense to me. But Christian.
Yeah, so part of it, so thank you for clarifying, Julian. So for example, the Black Panther Party claimed to represent Black folk, but the majority of Black folk did not like the Black Panther Party. So I'm just like, and they recruited principally African Americans, almost exclusively. They talked with some others, but they exclusively recruited them. So what you just kind of laid out for me was that the Panthers would fit, but they represent such a small subset of the Black population. And then I was thinking of the kind of the rest of Lasse's argument and how that worked out. That seems very different from like, you know, maybe the IRA represented a little bit more of the kind of Republican population in many respects. And then you can kind of think of more encompassing organizations. That seems to be, back to Lasse, this seems to represent very different dynamics as to kind of like the Panthers getting repressed and what you'd expect to happen versus the IRA getting repressed in like 1969 seems to be, so those are very different, despite the fact that they both might be EPR organizations. And so the other characteristics of the organizations and that triad that Julian was hinting at seems like that would be crucial to get in there, but I don't see much of that in the paper. So
I just to generalize Christian's point really quickly, since many of you are probably paying some attention to the presidential election in the United States. This is right. This is just politics, what Christian's talking about, right? There's all sorts of Republicans running around trying to figure out what the hell the leader of their party is and whether or not he speaks for them. And there are all sorts of Democrats who are sitting there scratching their heads trying to figure out how are they possibly going to vote for Hillary Clinton for whatever those reasons are. And so to the extent that we're comfortable coding political parties and their behavior, the EPR approach fits in with that whole approach as well. But and so Lasse, it does seem to me that well, I don't think you want to talk about political parties. That's a bad idea. Laying out that if that is part of your argument, right, then I think you want to bring that in. If part of your argument is going to hinge on the extent to which rebel groups don't, I mean, is that part of what you're expecting to find, that these rebel groups that claim to be acting actually do have support of the people? It seems to me maybe you're kind of arguing that, although frankly, it's been listening to this conversation that got me to really think, oh, actually, he might be arguing that. And I stole the floor from Julian before I give it to him on the two-finger. Lasse, did you want to comment?
I think there's very big variation on how much support these rebel groups actually have among these ethnic groups. I think in some cases, most individuals within the ethnic groups would give at least some passive support for the groups. Others would, of course, give active support. But in other cases, it would maybe be a minority among the ethnic groups actually supporting the rebel groups. So that would vary. But of course, it would take some popular support to be able to engage in civil conflict with the regime.
And would that affect how, whether or not you see the first mechanism? Would you code, if only a minority supported, would you say the first mechanism is, or is that just not relevant to your coding of the first mechanism?
So if they support the rebel group based on their grievances, then I would say that the first mechanism is present.
But if they don't, so the Black Panther Party by Christians, that didn't ramp up to 1,000, but if it had, you would code that as not potentially. Well, we don't need to get into how anyone will code the Black Panther Party. That is not productive. Let me kick it to Julian.
Yeah, just to clear that up, we have actually tried to explicitly code this very information in this mapping data set called NSA to EPR, where we have, as I said, tried to code explicitly whether the underlying ethnic constituency supports the rebel organization on a large scale. The reason why this is not incorporated into most operational definitions of conflict is that the further you go back in time, the more difficult it is to find information on this particular variable. And so there are a lot of missings where this is just very, very difficult to code. On the other hand, and this is just from the back of my head, I have toyed around with this variable once, used this as a robustness check to use a stricter conflict definition. Couldn't find any differences, at least in terms of statistical analyses. But the data is out there, so you can toy with it.
So I have another thing to add to this, and to me this is a conceptual slash theoretical, I'm not sure which bin to put it in, issue. So for instance, myself, Lischbach, some others have, or Lischbach tossed out and I've echoed this 5% rule, right? And Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence, he estimated that 2% was sufficient, right? And so I don't, to me, that doesn't, and maybe that's where you're going and part of why I might not be very persuadable. how would you argue that, you know, what if you looked at the Italian Red Brigades or the German Red Brigades, or how would you look at Sendero Luminoso or some of these other incredibly violent groups that that didn't obtain mass support, and that's presumably why they were using terror, but they're making claims on behalf. I guess I'd like to see more clarity about what, you know, so this goes back to, what do you think, being more clear about unpacking theoretically what you think their claims are and what sort of evidence you would need to make your coding judgments. I mean, I know you have an online appendix, and I didn't ask for it, so perhaps some of my questions would get addressed there. And if that's the case, then that's fine. But I encourage you, as you make revisions, to think about that a little bit. So I have Christian on a one finger, and then Julian on a one finger.
So the essence with the ones is we're kind of switching it up, but so let me give my half, which is a continuation, and then move to my one. The half is so part of this isn't directed towards you. I was not a fan of the exclusion discrimination label, as I saw that as repression, and I just thought they were getting slick and just labeling the same behavior that I was interested in. So your scenario is, I'm putting words in your mouth, but clarify, please. Social exclusion leads to protest, which, if repressed poorly, leads to civil war. My words. Repression leads to protest, which, if repressed poorly, leads to escalation of protest. So back to Julian's suggestion, it's a dyadic conflict, and then in Will's conception, you have this interesting sequence of turns that results in escalation. So I think you're doing an escalation story, but in a sense, you're smoothing over some of the subtle differences. So the exclusion stuff, notice I qualified it with social, right? The exclusion stuff doesn't necessarily involve the state, but it could. And it could be overlapping, right? You could have a socially exclusive society and a state that has embodied this particular thing, or just socially excluded, or just politically excluded. And so I think combining that is problematic, but that actually might lead to some of the other sequences. That was my half. The new thing is a version of this paper. I don't know that this is the paper you want to write, because this takes it away from the dynamic stuff, but it looks at it just from the state side. And so in a sense, what you have is a story of state failure, right? So they had exclusion that couldn't stop people from mobilizing, failure number one. Then people got mobilized and the state couldn't kill them off with repression, failure number two. And then you have the onset of this large scale thing, which presumably they can't contain, so therefore it goes on, failure number three. Now, I know you weren't necessarily trying to go there, but that particular sequence of bad decisions or inefficient governance, I found to be kind of interesting. And so I just wanted to kind of raise that as an alternative way to think about this. I think the dynamic and dyadic movement up the escalatory dynamic. I mean, I have this paper called States versus Challenges that I could never get freaking published, because it was a theory of linking together all of conflict studies and how escalatory dynamics were. Actually, you might have been there when I presented this thing, right? So it's now finally coming out in a book, but it's like the only place I could publish the crap. But nevertheless, that I think you're directly engaged in this kind of like, how do we, what's the pathway of escalation? And so I'm all for trying to figure that out, except you've mapped out a very kind of specific sequence of that, and then left me thinking about all the other pathways to get to not only that same location, but to others as well.
Lasse?
Yeah, so I guess we could also make a story about how states fail and how that is also an escalation process. On your first half point, Christian, so it's not social exclusion, it has to be political exclusion. So these groups cannot be represented at the state level. And of course, if the theory is correct, then that should be what creates grievances and what makes these excluded group mobilize.
Yeah, EPR only codes political exclusion.
Okay, my excitable two, where I just jumped up a second ago, is like, who gives a damn if they could become president if I'm freaking wealthy? I don't get the privileging of the executive. I don't care about being the president. I don't care about being in Congress. I care about having a ridiculous amount of money and having some land. And I'm just like, and if I have those things, then forget the executive. So I didn't quite get that. And so, especially as it relates to kind of conflict dynamics, right? You're suggesting that a group of people that have a grievance connect the problem of that grievance specifically with the executive because they can't sit in the same office. I'm like, whatever happened to economic sector inequality and all these literatures of world systems theories and dependency and all these other forms of inequality and C. Wright Mills that has nothing to do with the executive. It's got to do with you can't get X done in your village or in your community or every other level up to the executive. So I was wondering if that kind of privileging of the highest tier of governance had implication for how the conflict dynamics are taking place, not just in the capital, right? But it's taking place in different places in the country. So I'm wondering if that might be an alternative way to think about how things might escalate towards greater or lesser battle deaths.
I think in most cases, or maybe in all but a few cases, these things would go together. So if you don't have political power, then you would lose economic power and cultural power. Of course, it might be different in the US, but if you look at African countries or Asian countries, then if these groups are not represented politically, then they, maybe in a few cases, but for most parts, they won't have that much economic power.
Okay, Lasse. Oh, sorry.
That was my point.
I know, yeah. Julian, I'm looking at Julian, but saying Lasse.
Yeah, all these Europeans, huh?
Exactly.
Look all the same. Good. I want to connect a couple of points that have been made earlier. Will, you were talking about the audience of this paper. I think there's another audience that you need to think about, and that's the reviewers. And it's quite clear that at least some of the reviewers you are going to face are likely to be the authors of the theory that you are subjecting to empirical testing here. And so I think where the paper needs to be sharpened is in parts the representation of the actual theory that you're trying to test. So I think for hypothesis 1, you've given an adequate and acceptable, if not rather nice, description of the theory. But I'm not so sure about hypothesis 2, to be very honest with you. And so in the literature that you cite, especially this book, right? You will have noticed that hypothesis 2 is essentially covered on half a page to 1 page at most. And I would actually say that it's not the only possible channel. There's a couple others that they also mention. In particular, they also talk about claim making. And so I guess my point is that there's a little bit of a risk in the way that the paper is currently framed and set up, especially on the basis of hypothesis 2, that reviewers would argue that you're setting up a straw man here, you know? Which is obviously what you want to avoid. So the question for me is what to do about hypothesis 2. In part, I agree with some of your conceptual critique about hypothesis 2, right? So this goes actually back to some of the things that Christian said. Right? So we know repression is costly, and if it induces conflict, then why use it in the first place? Right? That's a fundamental puzzle. Now there's some newer literature, and Christian probably knows much more about this, on sort of endogenous repression, raising the question whether there's something like an optimal level of repression that, if applied at the right level, repression will prevent mass mobilization from occurring. And so is it that mobilization only occurs if repression isn't calibrated right by the government, is miscalculated or something like that? There's more work to be done here, and I guess it also goes back to some of Will's earlier comments about conceptual precision.
Okay, Lasse?
Yeah, so thanks, Julian. I get your comment. So I think that they're rather specific about the second part of the mechanism being repression. But of course, as you also mentioned, they don't specify what this repression is. And so I try to make it more specific by talking about violent repression. And of course, the reason for me to do so was linking back to Christian's comment that exclusion is, of course, also one form of repression. So this repression have to do something else. It has to radicalize people, and they argue that this escalation process is more likely when repression is violent and indiscriminate. But yeah, I'll try to be more precise here.
Christian on a 2.
Yeah, my 2 is it's kind of like since you're combining literatures anyway, let me add one more that you should add in. But so we've been kind of running and collectively, we, myself included, Will, we've been running on a repression has diverse effects kind of like trail for a while. But one of the mediating factors we find are kind of like things about the organization, right? So not just my last book, but Stanilin, Perlman, a bunch of Carl Dater Opp, a bunch of people have been looking at these organizational characteristics and trying to gauge exactly how, when they are perturbed, how, when they are repressed, the organization is shifted in some way, shape, or form that either facilitates or hinders the ability to kind of engage in subsequent activity. And so while I think the violent, indiscriminate behavior is important, there's this interaction with the organization that, and this is kind of, it's partly an EPR question, and I apologize for not knowing, but we get the clarification right now. If they have those type of variables regarding the kind of robustness of the organization, or how it's diffused across space and time, how members are not or interacting with one another, some sense of the kind of the claims making effort itself, because those would vary. Related back to an earlier point, if you had political and, let's say, social exclusion, I think that the organizations that you're able to develop out of that grievance would be different maybe than if you just had political exclusion but not the social one. And then if you had the economic and social and political, I'd argue that your organizations would probably be very different. So again, I'm kind of like, if you want to map out the sequence for us, I'm kind of willing to go with you on that exercise to see which sequences go where. But I kind of want you to go back a little bit further to kind of get me started on that trajectory, tell me more about the context, and then tell me more about that claims making effort.
Okay, Lasse, did you want to respond?
No, I take that point. I think it's a good one.
Okay. So I actually, I've got I want to raise an issue, but I realized I forgot when I was talking about the conceptualization, the causal notion. Just to draw your attention very quickly to page 5, you're right, ethnic exclusion leads to anti-government mobilization. And I know I'm picking on 2 words, leads to, but that's different from ethnic inclusion increases the likelihood of anti-government mobilization. And I think increases the likelihood is actually the what they're arguing. So that was just, you know, a specific point, but that I had intended to raise and forgot to. So I want to talk about page 20, and on there you write, this is the first sentence of the last paragraph on that page. Clearly, none of these Civil War onset fit the description of ethnic groups rebelling to gain access to the polity. Rather, they are counterinsurgencies intended to bolster the incumbent governments. And that sentence made me go, what? So one reader anyway was not following along to something that you thought was a clear implication. And let me try to unpack, we've talked a little bit about this, but I want to try to unpack that reaction. So there are 2 that you're talking about, the Chechen Civil War. And if I'm understanding the point you want to make is that the Russians started the Chechen Civil War, that there was a counterinsurgency by the Russians and that's what led to the Civil War. That doesn't strike me as relevant for assessing their hypothesis too. I don't, and so that's why I didn't make the connection. I just thought, I mean, if you had told me, well, I'm going to show you that there are instances where the state goes in and mobilizes to try to assert its authority over space, I mean, my honest reaction is, wait a minute, are we saying that we're certainly not saying, I think, that the Chechen Civil War is based on grievances, that the groups that lead the political leaders, whether they're part of the insurgent groups or not, make ethnic-based claims. And then whether or not the state starts the killing doesn't strike me as especially relevant. So there's a disconnect for me between what you're choosing to focus on with that H2, and you know, I'm only going to talk about the Chechen case, but similarly, you try to cover that in one paragraph, and so it's apparent to you what's happening, and why what you're seeing is so inconsistent, but it really wasn't to me. And I don't know if it's worth, if you'd like to try to unpack that for me now or not, but I wanted to at least draw to your attention that that paragraph in particular had me just going, huh, I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, I could try. So my argument is that in the literature it's stated like this. So when ethnic groups are politically excluded, then they will try to be included, and to do that they will mobilize. The regime will respond, in some cases violently. If they do so, a civil war onset is more likely.
Okay, can I pause for just a clarification there? You said for inclusion, so secession is out? Or autonomy is out?
No.
It's
Yeah,
not,
so
right?
inclusion in the central government or inclusion in a new state or whatever. So they will try to.
Right. Okay. Just wanted to make sure, and particularly thinking about the Chechen case, because if you did say inclusion, I was like, well, it's not a case I know very well, but my impression is they're not hoping to become more centrally included in the Russian state, right? It's more on autonomy. Okay.
Yeah. So my point is that the theory claims that these civil wars are likely to emerge because excluded ethnic groups want to change their political status, but that's not what we see in Chechnya. They already got their autonomy. They already broke free from Russia, and this second civil war onset in Chechnya is simply a continuation or a war relapse when the Russian central government tried to reassert its power in this breakaway republic.
So I see. So the thing that I'm losing is that the theory, as you're reading it, is really focused on distinct onsets, and so you agree that the first, you agree that Chechens had these grievances. You're arguing that that they were able to actually break away. And therefore the grievances dissipated. Yeah, it's interesting. I think back to, so I am very by default always thinking about expectations and thinking in expectations, and the theory probably isn't clear on that, and so I probably just added in on my own. But when Julian said, the expectations, and you said, oh, that's interesting, you hadn't thought about that, that's just natural, normal thinking for me. So I think that's part of why I'm reacting. You're focused on what is that status quo at the moment, and their theory suggests that there will only be onset. I now understand what you're saying, and to know whether I agreed or not, I'd frankly have to go back and reread their theory, and I might. But in the way I consume their theory, that's not what they're saying. So clarifying, so bringing more clarity in the theoretical. Now I'm just repeating stuff that Julian said. But when you're discussing the hypotheses, trying to be more clear about what would not be that path. Thinking about how you're hearing me say it, right? Because I know you're like, gosh, I spent several pages trying to be clear about that, and I tried. Yes, that's all true. You did, but obviously, I got lost. If that helps. I think Christian on it too.
Julian had 2 before me, but I'm willing to go Julian, after.
And then Christian.
Okay. I have to agree with Will here. I'm not 100% convinced that the depiction of the theory with regard to what they would call separatist autonomy, or sometimes even self-exclusion, is actually adequate. And I guess this goes back to my first point about exclusion being a dyadic phenomenon, right? What's underlying all of this theoretical work is the notion of nationalism. That's basically the general idea behind exclusion conflict nexus. And of course, separatism or separatist autonomy, self-exclusion, that's one way of gaining control, or for a group to self-rule, right? To use Hector's terms here. And if we think about the state as a whole, states don't like that, right? Governments don't like that. Ruling groups don't like that. They're threatened in their position. So in the bigger scheme of things, I don't think this is contradicting the theory at all. It's just a slightly different path. I would also be a bit careful in your assumption that it's the group that has to start the conflict, right? This goes back. Maybe the Chechen example is a good one. So if the Chechens weren't mobilized when the Russians went in, it would have been a one-sided massacre, right? But that's not what happened. So why is it not what happened? It's because they were mobilized, because they had an army and fired back, essentially, right? So conflict is also a dyadic phenomenon, which, yeah, and I'm not
Julian, if I could just jump in, it's actually not, it's dyadic, but not directed dyadic, right? Is that what you're saying, right? It's a pair, but it doesn't matter which pair starts it.
Yes.
So maybe I can ask you, Julian, would you argue that in the Chechen case that political exclusion actually caused or had a causal effect on the civil war onset?
Yes, quite clearly. In the form of self-exclusion by the Chechens. Right? The exclusion had gotten to the point where the Russian government was losing control over a territory that has some financial and strategic value, and as a means of regaining control over said territory.
And would you then still argue that political grievances are the mechanism that
grievances are the mechanism why the Chechens fired back?
Okay. Okay.
Right? Otherwise, they would simply concede, but they didn't.
But that goes to expectation, right? If they didn't, then they expect grievances as a consequence if they acquiesce. But and so if I don't know if you want to end up developing that point. And just to let everybody know, Sydney unfortunately has a really bad audio connection and is only catching a part of this, and so hasn't been jumping in, although I'm trying to coax her to jump in, even given her absence of what the heck's being said. But Christiana too.
Yeah, so I mean, a large part of where you go with this, Lasse, is kind of onset is a function of a tactical miscalculation, to use Julian's phrase, where governments kind of like they do the wrong thing, right? So they're zigging when they should zag. They're repressing violently when they should accommodate or selectively target. And so that's kind of missed, right? Which is like, so why do governments make that stupid mistake? And so I did a piece with Cyan Loyal called "The States Must Be Crazy." Kind of just like, okay, if states know that there is a probability after they repress that more dissent and more resistance could take place, why would they engage in the repression if we expect them to be rational, right? But you could actually make an argument that they want rebellion and they want resistance, but I'm not going there. But the other thing was kind of like, I would part of the thing that I find intriguing about this is after exclusion, right? You have the panoply of responses within a community. Some are just like, that's just our lot in life. Some are just like, change. Someday there's going to be a change, right? Some are just like, I'm out. Let's secede. Some of them are just like, okay, let's protest and push. And some are facile enough to kind of like, adopt a couple of these. So what I would find interesting is starting with this exclusion and then mapping out these responses. And then I think part of how I was reading it was, right, you have this reservoir of the population, you have this repertoire of activities that they can undertake, and at a particular tactical combination in the dyad, the non-violent being met with the violent, then a bunch of these other people now are willing to join this this kind of like more aggressive response, and the organization can accommodate them, and that leads to some escalation. But a lot of those parts, a lot of the parts of the thing that I just laid out, you don't give me the constellation of these other actors. And I think you're kind of letting the logic of the kind of violent repression of the nonviolent movement, what we know about that in part, explaining how we get to this other stuff. But it seems like there's a bunch of different, I guess my problem was going back to something I said earlier. My problem is that there's a bunch of different ways that you could generate the same, number of deaths that has nothing to do with the mass population shifting. And I think you've hinted enough that you care about this broader constituency of the ethnic group and them getting involved and that having implications. And you haven't parsed that from, there's a core group of small individuals who are just good at killing, and they escalate the number to a certain level that then gets us to pay attention to it. The other thing is like, Uppsala has been really bad about disaggregating the deaths, right? Like, okay, you could have 25 battle deaths, but the state could have killed 24, and the challenger killed 1, and that's very different from an equal kind of distribution. And I think they did disaggregate it, but for only for maybe 98 to the present. But I do remember I remember hearing someone talk about there was a disaggregation, but there might be something about that disaggregation that tells you something about the kind of escalatory dynamic that might be useful. And I'm not sure what the overlap would be with the groups that you're paying attention to, but that might help you to kind of like maybe select or tell some of those narratives and tease some of these other things out.
Lasse?
Yeah, just about the battle death aspect, I think that they demand that a certain number of casualties should be at both sides. But I think you're right, Christian, that they only actually disaggregated the measure from 90, 80 or something like that. Yeah.
So I want to toss out an idea. It actually ties back to a point I was making earlier. Have you given any thought to seeing where on the regression line these, where are these cases that you've selected in their regressions, right? Are they at all close? I realize that nothing's actually going to be close, right? The predicted probability on any of these events probably doesn't go above 0.25. Although maybe, I don't know, Julian, were you just shaking your head in disagreement? So what is that predicted probability?
0.25 would be a dream. Right?
Oh, okay, right, okay. So
0.025 is more realistic. Right?
Okay, okay, it's worse than I thought. So, so we know you're going to be going into this train wreck of, trying to parse, but I wonder if there's any information there. I mean, would it be interesting, for instance, I would think so, if you found that the 5 cases that seem to fit the path as you've understood it are twice as likely to be close to, the better predicted than not. So I don't know. Is that at all consistent with what you're trying to do in this paper, or is that really just asking you to do something that's a completely unrelated task?
Well, I guess it would be interesting if there actually is a pattern, so that these cases, which in my understanding actually fit both of these causal mechanisms, if they should be more likely to occur, that would be interesting. But I would be hesitant to like choose 1 or 2 cases on the line. I think that would make reviewers afraid that I actually just chose cases that either fit.
Oh, I agree. I agree. The suggestion is, would there be any information from, given that you already selected several cases and you didn't look at the line to do so, right? Would that be useful or not? And it wasn't clear to me whether you would think so. But so, you want to respond, or you good?
No, I think I have to think more about that. But
okay.
Thanks.
All right. I think I have Christian on one.
So I liked part of your kind of like Kivu Banyamulenge conversation, but that said, there's divisions between the Hutu and the Tutsi within each. So like the North versus the Central Hutu, the Anglophone versus the Francophone Tutsi. That kind of bothered me. You mentioned genocide and civil war, leave out the interstate war, and I'm just kind of like, I'm pushing back. They invaded from another country. Let's get very clear with the case. And then just you have the Rwandan government going for kind of like retribution into the Kivu area, but also we now know they're also interested in extracting resources, right? So it's like, so I'm like, if you're going to go there, then take me all the way there and then give me all of that, even though some of the story gets complicated in many ways. And it's strange because if you go back in history, right, so the Tutsi that leave because of earlier persecution for the group that just engaged in the revolution and then started to purge them. They escape, then they return. So actually, this is part of your exclusion story, but you had truncated the discussion towards the late 80s and early 90s. But actually, if you go back further, this gets you to a deeper understanding of exactly that sequence that we were talking about. So I'm kind of like, I'm caught, right? I have enough respect for qualitative work that I'm like, if you're going to go there, then go there fully. But most manuscripts don't give most article length treatments of these cases don't really give enough space to actually go into detail. And so I'm always kind of caught with people that are trying to do cases thoroughly. So I'm sensitive to it, but I'm also kind of like, there's some parts of this story that you need to put in there. And I think it twists, but enriches your kind of discussion a little bit. And so I just wanted to kind of, we don't normally talk about that, but I kind of wanted to go there before we broke.
Okay. Did you want to respond, Lasse?
Yeah. So do you think, Christian, that it would be enough to explicate these points in the online appendix, or do you actually think that there are too many cases here to get a good enough picture of what's going on?
So I'll give my opinion, and then I hope everyone else chimes in, because we would all potentially serve as reviewers or something like this. I'm caught, right? If you do one case thoroughly, then someone's gonna be like, yeah, but what's this tell us about the rest of the world? So then you're screwed. But then if you do a light version of a bunch of different cases, then anyone who knows anything about the cases is gonna be like, clearly they don't know anything about the cases. And I don't know how many people actually use the online appendices for anything. Which empirically we should be able to see, right? How many have downloaded online appendices? I'd love to see some research on that. So there's a part of me that's kind of like, if you want to mention a bunch of cases, that's cool, and then give me some kind of table, and then use that to kind of summarize. But give me a couple in a little bit more detail. That's the balance that I would kind of try to strike.
Yeah, I would try to attack that by sticking with the lots of detail in the online appendix approach, and not trying to, I mean, you need to go into more detail on that one paragraph. Hold on, I just messed up something here. Hopefully you can hear me. On that paragraph I noted, but on page 20, but for me, the bigger thing that will help with this is if you're clear about what we should expect generally before you get into the cases, because then you have a defense against the reader who says, oh, you didn't talk about this and that. Well, you've laid out that those things aren't important to your judgment for this purpose. So that's how I would go about that. Sid or Julian, did you want to weigh in on this? Nope. Okay. Lasse, we've only got a few minutes left. Is there another question that you would like to throw to the audience?
Yeah, maybe if we have a couple of minutes, maybe I could just get Julian to explicate his point about the dyadic. I think it was one of his first comments about this dyadic relationship. So what would you actually want me to specify in that respect? Do I focus too much on the excluded group, or too much on the state, or is it just how they interact that you would want me to specify?
That's a good question. I guess in general, exclusion describes the relationship between the group and the state, right? So it's something that occurs between them, with one party excluding and the other one being the subject to this exclusion. I think what I would want to see is a more complete appreciation of this very point. For example, in the way you address reverse causation. Factoring in things like anticipation, I think the Iraqi case is a good one here. It also plays out in the way you discuss autonomy in the Chechen case. Yes. I think that would be my main comment at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we're basically at time. No, Chris has it too.
Yeah, my two on this was I agree with Julian's thing, but as I was taking it was it's really a framing of the piece, right? Because right now you kind of are like, there's this actor and they engage in this, and then this actor does this, and then this actor does this, as opposed to nesting this, as he's suggesting, is like, okay, I think the dyadic framework is suggesting that you can't talk about this phenomena unless you're talking about both sides. And we've been really bad about doing that. And so you can take any of the Civil War pieces, they're either taking the side of the challenger or the side of the government, and yet the definition of the very thing that we're supposedly talking about involves both sides being present, both sides being active. So it implies a dyadic framework, but we haven't used that language consistently. You catch it by giving us this side does this side does that. So you're there, but you just haven't kind of embraced that language that would kind of bring that home, that we cannot study kind of state challenger interactions or behaviors unless we are doing both sides. And we haven't really stated it as firmly as that, but I think the dyadic format and discussions of that and this kind of, I think the conflict repression nexus tried to take us there because it's saying it's a nexus, right? But many people aren't adapting that. And then the armed conflict stuff, although you look at the definitions, it gets us back to both sides. They haven't necessarily taken us in that way. So I'm very much sensitive to and agree with Julian's take on, we need to adopt this framework and push that a lot more fervently, because that's what we're doing. And we've just been kind of finding ways around it.
Okay. Well, did you want to respond, Lasse, or?
Now I just want to say thanks a lot, guys. This was very helpful, and I think yeah, it will help me improve the piece. So thanks a lot for taking all the time to read it and give me these comments today. Much appreciated. Great.
Thank you.
Well, and I want to thank you, Lasse, for sending it in, and of course thank Julian and Sydney, and particularly Sydney for rolling with. Sorry that technology was not working well with you today. Thanks for sticking it out with us, and just thank Discussants generally, because without their participation we wouldn't be able to do this. So that wraps it up. Thank you very much, and be well, everybody.
Peace.